I'm JerryGrover, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
The best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have JerryGrover on the show. He's written an amazing book called Geology of the Book of Mormon. So we're going to get more acquainted with this book and find out what a geologist says about the Book of Mormon. What should it have? Should it have volcanoes? I know we've talked about that before on Gospel Tangents, and Jerry's going to give us our answer. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have, I think, my first geologist on the show. Could you go ahead and tell us who you are?
JerryGrover. I'm a licensed professional geologist and engineer as well, civil engineer.
Okay.
Written a few books, which I think caught your attention. So
yeah, you live here in Utah County.
Yeah. Yep. American Fork.
And so tell us a little bit about your academic background. Where'd you go to school?
My undergraduate was BYU. I was a geological engineer. They didn't have a second major, but also mechanical engineering. And then
kind of a dual major?
Yeah, they don't really offer that at BYU, but I had enough that I got accepted into grad school as a mechanical engineer at University of Utah.
Oh, so you're conflicted.
Yeah, and then I shifted to civil engineering, so I was even more conflicted. And so I got my Master of Engineering up at University of Utah. And so I'm a licensed structural civil engineer and also a licensed professional geologist.
Okay. And so when they play each other, who do you root for?
Well, my dad was a BYU professor, so I kind of had to be careful.
I'm sorry.
My son's a University of Utah fan. So.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. He must be cool.
Yeah. So I probably root for Utah State. So.
Oh, there you go. That's weird. Just to be nonpartisan.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, you've got a book, a great book called Geology in the Book of Mormon. Why don't you show the camera?
Yeah, this is kind of got some tabs on it and stuff. But
there you go. And it's an expensive book. It's out of print now. You got to spend like $80 to get that thing.
Yeah, well, I only printed. It's actually free as a PDF. So all of my books, I only print a limited number. I'm not in the book selling business, and mostly donate to libraries, and then a few people that want hard copies. So I could do a reprint, but I just haven't got around to doing an update. So I'm working on some other books. So.
Okay, well, and we might talk about some other books too. So, so you kind of got a geology background, civil and mechanical engineering background, and so tell us why you decided to write Geology of the Book of Mormon.
Well, I just I kind of followed kind of Book of Mormon geography models, and John Sorensen's kind of models that he proposed, and even from the time I served an LDS mission, and so I actually got some of his early drafts to kind of translate into Italian because I spoke Italian, and so it always kind of interested me, but I really didn't have any inklings to publish anything. I assumed, well, somebody else might, some BYU professor or something, but really nobody had done anything, and so I kind of thought, well, something that's really just been sitting out there with no research, as there are a lot of those topics, and there's very few scientific approaches to the Book of Mormon, as I found out. Looking at a lot of people write books on doctrine and the text and translation techniques and all that, but very few people have actually really looked scientifically at what's said in the Book of Mormon or what's indicated, and
right.
So that's kind of I have a website. It's basically dedicated. It's basically scientific and linguistic research. So that's really what I engage in and support. And I've also funded some other people's projects. So.
Okay, and then before we dive into the book, I want to get a couple other things. I pointed out to you about a month ago probably that you have an entry in Divergent Paths of the Restoration. So do you lead a Mormon group? Are you like a prophet or something?
Well, I guess that's a career I hadn't really thought of. I guess it's possible. No, I was kind of surprised when you pointed that out. I'm like, I didn't really even know that they knew I existed.
Yeah, so Steve Shields, if you're watching,
I think he caught on because I did the characters document translation, right? Yeah. And then he wrote an article in the JHW or JHWA.
John Whitmer Historical.
Yeah, on the different was like 3 people that had attempted translations of that.
Of the characters document.
Yeah, so that's why I was in that article, and so I think maybe that's how he ran across me. Because I don't know him from Adam, right?
He's a really cool guy.
No, I'm sure I've seen him on like some podcasts.
Yeah.
He lives in Korea or something like that. Seemed like a nice guy.
Yeah, he's a former 70 in the Community of Christ. And
Yeah. So for me, it was like, well.
in fact, he was at Whitmer in September here in Independence. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't really involve, like I say, most of my books are not church history stuff, right? So they don't really cross over into a lot of that, other than when I did one on the metallurgy of the plates, looking at how they were made. And so I got into a little bit just because I needed the initial, descriptions of the plates. And so I do kind of engage a little bit in church history, but not a lot. So a lot of it's kind of, there's not very many. If I'm leading a church, there's like 3 people that really do scientific or even geographical research anymore. So,
so you do go to LDS Church, I guess. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're not a schismatic leader or anything.
No, I mean, I look at other religions, studied other religions. I'm open-minded about. I don't think we have some. License on the patent on the truth, right? I mean, you can get truth from a lot of areas. Science is just one. So I'm open-minded to listening to all kinds of people.
So you're also my second politician on this show. Can you talk a little? I had Darren Perry. He ran unsuccessfully as a Democrat in the 1st congressional district. I had him run right after he lost.
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of repressed memory there, so I'm not sure much I can tell you. But So back in 1994, I went off my medication, decided to run for office. So I was elected as a Utah County Commissioner and served from 1995 to 2006 as a county commissioner. So, and I'm basically, I worked in the private sector before that, and then after that, I've been back in the private sector as an engineer. So that was really my only stint. In government, per se.
And so you were a good road builder, I guess, basically. Is that what the county commissioner does?
I knew how to build roads. I knew about the recorder's office because I actually worked when I was a geologist, I did some researches in the recorder's office. So I actually kind of ran because I thought my skill set matched the job as opposed to just being some ego boost or something like that. And personally, I was happy if people didn't know who I was, My neighbors thought I was on maybe city council, so they had no clue what I really did, and that was fine with me. So, I did develop 2 important maxims in life, though, as a politician. One was, things are always darkest before they go completely black. And the second was, there's no problem so large that I can't run away from it.
Oh, cool.
So, anyway, and I thought it was important that people run that actually have skill sets, right? They're not just attorneys or real estate people or people climbing. I had no interest in being governor or a senator. I just felt like I could do a good job at that job. I did my best. So.
Well, very good, very good. Well, so tell us how you're kind of a geologist, kind of an engineer,
right? What
are some of the passages in the Book of Mormon, I guess, that caught your attention and led you to writing the book?
Well, there had actually been a few articles done by some BYU geologists. Bart Koalas did one, maybe did a little small, kind of paper pamphlet, and Dr. Bear, both of those I had were when I went to school there, were teachers, but they were just very generic, right? They just said, well, third Nephi looks like it has, looks like a volcanic eruption, but no one had really said, okay, let's apply this to actually the models. The other thing I was seeing is the geographic models. You had, a variety of them. Some people have their own personal ones, and they're all over the place. But they're
do you want to give us a brief rundown of the different geography theories really quick?
Well, yeah, I don't know all because there's, everybody's got a website.
I'll help you.
Yeah, I know you. I mean, basically, you have, in Mesoamerica, you have probably 2 primary models, the River Sidon being the Grijalva River or the Simacinta River being the Sidon River. There's also another one by Richard Hout, which basically has it further over to the the east in the Matogua Valley.
Kind of Guatemala area.
Yeah, and pretty much in Mesoamerica, most of the models agree that the land northward corresponds to the Olmec Jaredite the Olmec civilization, which is an earlier civilization. And so you do have commonality with the two primary models. They also believe the premise is the land of Nephi is Valley of Guatemala City. So you actually have some commonality, but it diverges on which was the river site. And then you have a few people, all of Yucatan, and but there are certain people that just have their own. They don't have any following, but they just propose and write a website.
Well, there's like Baja also.
Yeah, the Baja, they've kind of got a website there, and so I actually commented a little bit on in a later chapter. The book was basically saying, okay, what I'm going to do here is you have all these people. The geography and the passages that relate to geography, I mean, there's not that many that are very extensive, right? And so you've kind of gotten as far as you're going to get in terms of establishing the models, right? Now it's just arguing about, which river or that kind of thing, but there's not really much more in the text to ferret out. So I said, we need, and you have the archaeological parameters that you have to then apply, linguistic parameters. Again, because the text of the geography is just one parameter, right? It has to lay in and match other parameters. So I thought, well, the geology is a parameter that's never been looked at,
right?
That can actually, that I don't care whose model it is, they need to look at that and make sure that their model is consistent with what the Book of Mormon says geologically. And so that was the attempt of the book, was to actually establish, number one, was establish that all of the things described in the Book of Mormon that have geological, can be explained geologically. So that was part of the attempt of the book, say, okay, everything in 3rd Nephi, all of these things, can be explained by some geological event, whether it's the vapor or mist of darkness, tumultuous noises, groanings of the earth, rendings of the rock, quakings, all those things. So I kind of went through that to say, okay, yes, all of these things are consistent and can be explained geologically. So, and then it was like, okay, now that you have that, you have, how do you lay your model? You have to have potential for seismic activity in the right places, right? It says the land northward had the bulk of the destruction. So again, some models don't really subscribe to a volcano. They try to come up with some other explanations. But whatever it is, you have to, show that you at least have laid down, the cities you've laid down are going to, the ones that were destroyed by show how they were destroyed, right?
During 3rd Nephi, when the Great Destruction.
Yeah, and that was if you have Ammonihah, not all of them are 3rd Nephi. I mean, you have a couple prison events where the prison shook.
Oh yeah, like Alma.
Mm-hmm. Right, and there was a great sound, which I actually explained. There's actually what's called a super shear earthquake that occurs in strike slip faults that are typically granitic underlying rock. So if you've got a location as Ammonihah, you're going to have to show that Ammonihah is actually in a seismically active zone, probably strike slip, and show that there's probably some sort of granitic rock somewhere at depth or something that would generate this, because a super shear earthquake creates a sonic boom. So that's because it talked about a great sound that surprised them all, right? And so that's one, and then you have the other prison event. It basically, this is in the land of Nephi, where it talks about shaking, then a cloud came down, then a shaking cloud. So that's looking at a volcanic eruption earthquake. So you're going to have to show proximity to a volcano in that location, your valley of your land of Nephi, right? So those are a couple outside the 3rd Nephi event that are geologic events. And so the point was to say, okay, let's lay it. It gives any people working on a model will have to account for the geology. Now, they could maybe interpret something a little differently than me, that's fine. But you at least have to account for this parameter. You can't just say, oh, there's a fault somewhere in our model, right? You've got to show that it's a large enough fault. You can't have, my book. And then
so you're focused mostly on like earthquake activities. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at some different things. So I also looked at storm, right? I looked at some meteorological events because that's one of the questions. Could it be a hurricane, right? When it talks about the Great Storm, or is it talking about just a volcanic eruption that could be described as a great storm anciently? And so I looked and said, okay, and what I did is I said, and some of these answered questions out for other models, but I said the Sorensen model is the most developed, right? He has maps. He's got has cities laid out. Most of the models are,
roughly here, roughly
right.
there.
Anytime they try to zoom in, it starts having problems, right? and that's why anybody can propose a model. But actually, when you have to actually lay it in on the ground specifically, have archaeological sites match up, have cultures match up, and this is just saying, listen, your geology has got to match up as well. So I took the Sorensen model and laid it in. But there were some other questions I wanted to answer. And first of all, some people said, well, just a volcano, and then you have the volcanic earthquakes. And so I looked at it, I says, no, volcano. I actually said, one of the areas of geology is actually hazard analysis. So there are people, geologists, all they do is look at, a city, for city planners that are located next to a volcano, like Mexico City, for example.
Pompeii.
Yeah, they probably, most of the city planners were killed. But what I'm saying, modernly, so you would say, hey, we've got this volcano near Mexico City. If it erupts, where are we going to get our ash fall? Where are we going to get what's called lahars, mud flows coming out? And so you have to incorporate that into your planning. On the Wasatch Front, we have earthquake, right? So we're a seismic 5. So if you're planning to build along the fault, what's the distance away from the fault? Where are the debris flows that are going to come out? You look historically where debris flows have come out. So you actually create hazard maps. Say, okay, we probably don't want to build right here because when an earthquake happens, you may wipe out this subdivision or something like that. So,
but do they build them anyway?
Some cities do approve of them. Like when I was a county commissioner, that's what we did. We developed a hazard map for Utah County, right? And said, okay, these are some
shouldn't build here.
Or if you do, you need to mitigate, right? Like avalanche. Well, you can build in an avalanche zone. Your house has to be designed, in such a way that it can shed an avalanche. It doesn't just take it off down the mountain,
right?
And, concrete roof, whatever it is. And so, I'm not saying that doesn't mean you can't build. But you're going
to have more stringent building requirements.
Yeah, you have to consider what the underlying geology is, and it's soils too, right? Some soils, and I actually kind of go there through in the book, is some soils are very susceptible to destructive movement called liquefaction. Basically, because they're saturated, when the earthquake hits, a pressure wave goes and just turns it to jello.
Turns the ground to jello.
Yeah, and so it can't support. It doesn't have any bearing.
Is it kind of like quicksand where it just kind of sinks in?
It just kind of is not able to sustain load. Yeah, and so the buildings will shift this way, or it will crack.
Kind of like the Leaning Tower of Pisa?
Yeah, well, actually in my book I talk, in Japan there's one that has a series of apartment buildings. They're just, one goes this way, one flip this way.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and because you also have these surface waves that undulate going through. You have a pressure wave. Pressure wave you can kind of think of like a tube with ping pong balls in it. You hit one end and then there's a wave goes through, a force goes through, and ping pong ball pops out the other end. So it's not like and so the pressure wave, it's just like a hit, and then it gets pressure moving through as a wave, and that's what destabilizes, if you will, the soil that's susceptible to liquefaction. And then you also have the undulating waves that can move through that also cause damage. But what happens is, essentially, when you have the area that's liquefaction, if you have using the Richter scale, that we don't use that much anymore in geology, but
oh, really?
Well, there's it's the moment scale. It correlates.
You mentioned that in the book, but most people are familiar with the Richter scale.
Yeah, and they still use that. And it's mostly because on the higher ends, the Richter scale doesn't work very well. I mean, it's kind of okay in the middle. I mean, this is very, summarizing it not very academically, but and so you actually. will get it'll basically move your area that is susceptible to liquefaction will be like equivalent to maybe 2 or 3 on the Richter scale, meaning if you get hit with a 5, the damage may be what would be an 8, just because the ground is unstable. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you can kind of calculate and say, I mean, again, it's rough, that areas like that will experience a certain higher level of seismic shaking or damage. And so I actually considered that when I did the model. When I laid out the Sorensen model, for example, I had to actually do my own mapping because I couldn't find anywhere where they had actually looked at liquefaction. So I kind of took what formations were and kind of applied that, because I had to know that, because if he has a city that's on an area that's not liquefaction or is liquefaction, that'll make a difference as to the destructive, whether it's going to be destroyed or not.
Oh, okay.
And then the other thing, and so this is, again, laying it on the ground, looking at, and so, for example, the volcano. So I looked at all the volcanoes in Mesoamerica, and they have to erupt during the right time period, right?
Right.
And so kind of wiped out a lot of them. They also had to be situated such, because it describes the lands northward and southward, the mist of darkness covered all the face of the land. I mean, you have to take that with a grain of salt. I mean, they obviously didn't have people on every mountaintop or whatever, but so it had to at least substantially cover that. So you couldn't have one that's, because the Sorensen model has, Guatemala, basically Guatemala City all the way up kind of to Veracruz, kind of that's your total extent. So you had to have a volcano, the reasonable eruption would have, that coverage. And so I kind of looked at, and I asked certain questions. So like I kind of referring back to what I started with, and that is, you have earthquakes associated with volcanoes, but volcanic earthquakes are not very powerful. They can get up to like 7, and they're really only in close proximity to the volcano. And also
I think the big one that people, at least our age, remember, I remember there was the Harry Truman at the base of Mount St. Helens, and he's like, I'm not going anywhere. And the volcano just buried his house, and he died there.
Yeah.
But you're saying that wasn't, the destruction didn't extend a long distance? It was just local to the volcano? Is that what you're saying?
That was the question. And so there's actually, as part of this hazard analysis, what geologists will do is, because, you don't have Mount St. Helens. When was the last time it erupted, for
1980,
example?
I think it was.
Yeah, 82, but before that. So you're looking at, say, okay, we know this volcano has erupted. We actually can, measure radiometric dating. Okay, it was 1,000 years ago or something. But, how do you...
Well, that brings up another question. How do you date, especially from geological? I mean, everybody's familiar with carbon dating, but there's no carbon in metals, generally speaking. How would you date when a volcano erupted?
Well, the real old ones, they use different technique, because radiocarbon only goes back, I can't remember, 20, 30,000 years, and then they use other, but there are other argon, there's other degradation of chemicals for the ancient stuff. I didn't care about that, because the Book of Mormon is within radiometric.
Just 2000.
Yeah, right. And so the dating would be, you have a lava flow, or you have some pyroclastic flow, or
that doesn't have or does it have carbon in it?
No, but you would date what's underneath it. Meaning you'll find charred trees.
Oh,
or underneath.
They
the flow.
wouldn't just be completely incinerated and gone.
Well, some, but I mean, at some point you have something underneath it.
Okay.
Where so you can say, okay, here's. And then the ash, the best way is actually the ash, if it's a pyroclastic, because you'll have marshes, right, where the ash gets laid down, then you'll have more deposition on top of it of material that has organic stuff in it.
Oh, okay.
So you have this superposition, right? And so...
Because I keep thinking...
So you can zone it in.
Hawaii is one of my favorite places to go, and I've been to the national park there on the Big Island, because they have, for the last...
That's where I was born.
200 years.
Actually.
Oh, were you really?
Yeah, that's what my book. I started out. I was born on the flanks of an extinct volcano. It was not on the Big Island. It was on Oahu, just up in Hawaii.
And Oahu's awesome too. But in the last, say, 200 years, we've been able to be like, oh well, we were here. We know when this lava flow happened and when this lava flow happened. But of course, before 200 years, it's a lot harder to date that kind of stuff.
Right. And so you're looking for things that you can date radiometrically. And then you also look at superposition because you have lava flows sitting on top of other lava flows and lava flows. So you can actually get at least the sequence, right?
Right.
Oldest on the bottom, youngest on the top.
Right.
And so you can extrapolate. And there's also other, sometimes you have a flow that has a fracture because it's in an earthquake, and then there's another flow on top of it, so you can tell that the earthquake happened between the two.
Oh, okay.
Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there's actually geological events that intervening that you can also help you figure out.
How accurate are those kinds of dating? Like
It depends.
100 years, 10 years, 1 year?
Yeah, well, typically, I mean, there have actually been improvements in the radiometric technique, right? And so they're more accurate now than they were before. Sometimes, I mean, this is a whole nother discussion, but you actually it's based on the carbon-14 in the atmosphere. And so there's actually some fluctuation. So sometimes there's maybe a few 100-year period, you can't tell because it's almost the same amount or it's gone up or because it's kind of this curve, they call it the calibration curve. And so sometimes if it's in a certain time frame, it is a little more difficult to tie in. But it's typically 100, 200, 300-year spread. And then statistically, they do what's called the sigma analysis. So you could kind of say it's more probable in this section. So you kind of have this larger range and then statistically.
Are we talking statistics now? That's my language.
Well, I won't deviate from the mean here and talk about discuss statistics. But so basically, yeah. And so I had to look at that, meaning some of them had large, and some of them there's dispute because are they getting the level? Again, it was like you have, one eruption up kind of near Mexico City went into it was the Chile volcano went into a city. And so they were saying, well, they were sampling the level immediately where it hit, or we're sampling some lower level of organic material, corn cobs or whatever it is that they're finding in the archaeological site. So it's not like everything is, certain researchers will find different results, right?
Okay.
So there is, and I tried to look at that. So I actually.
But usually with 200 or 300 years,
sometimes within 100, I mean, it just depends. And again, I wasn't down there sampling, right? So I'm just relying on all the reports or the publications of each on the volcanoes. And I actually list all the eruptions of each volcano. I screened the volcanoes to say that these ones didn't erupt. And that's the problem with the Baja modeling. Oh, there's volcanoes. Like, well, none of them erupted in the last 10,000 years, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah, problem.
They're way too old.
Yeah, I mean, there's one way up north. There's one on an island clear out. But I mean, not in the area that you need it. And so, yeah, that's a problem. So they actually say, well, okay, we have to take a volcano out of our model. And so they say there's this big fog bank came in, a hurricane came in, and then a big fog appeared. And I'm like, I don't know where you're going to get that type of meteorological conditions, right? Where a hurricane is followed by quiescent fog, and the fog had to kill people too, right?
Well, because Heartland has the same issue. I mean, I know they have the New Madrid fault, which would explain the earthquakes and the shaking.
Well, it does, but it doesn't. Because, again, the other thing you have to look at.
Well, one of their things is they say, well, it doesn't say volcanoes in the Book of Mormon, so you can't assume it was a volcano.
Yeah, well, it actually does, kind of. I can give an explanation there. It's not in the book. But the other thing I looked at is you have so the first thing I determined was, let me kind of backtrack here.
Okay.
So when you're looking at ancient events, you can sometimes take a recounting of that, Pompeii, for example, or other recountings, or see what the destruction was. I mean, certain when I'm looking at earthquakes anyway, certain buildings collapsed, right? And so you can actually rate the shaking level. We know they call it the Mercalli scale.
Okay.
Different numbers. So they say, on the Mercalli scale, that's at 8 because buildings collapsed. I mean, completely collapsed. So you can actually go up the scale. So you got dishes shaking or something like that to describe, things shook, but nothing. So you can kind of actually grade it, and then there's a correlation to the Richter scale, more or less. You can kind of like throw that over. And so that was the thing, is I'm looking at, okay, you've got all these cities completely collapsing, right? And high and right, low, and it's like that. Volcanic earthquakes aren't to that level unless they're right on the flank of the volcano or something. And then
Like Harry Truman was. With
yeah, and that's the least of your worries is an earthquake if you're on the flank of a volcano when it erupts. A pyroclastic, you just get burned to crisp.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I looked at that and I said, so a volcano itself cannot account for all the destruction, right? So you do have to
But it does account for the mists of darkness, right?
yeah, it accounts for certain elements of it, right, which earthquakes don't. And so that was the conclusion I reached. You had to have a volcano and a regional fault system.
Both together, not just one or the other.
Right. Both together. And then I looked at, can that happen? Has that occurred? And yes, it has. In fact, probably the theory is that the pressure is built up in the volcano and then the earthquake is the trigger, right? And so the earthquake happens and then the volcano erupts because it caused.
So the earthquake kind of causes the eruption?
Yeah, I mean, eruptions are building up of pressure, steam, whatever, underneath in the magma chamber, and it's come up. At some point, it reaches a point where it blows, right? I mean, but if you move it or you create a fissure or something because of the earthquake, then it can precipitate. It won't cause a volcanic eruption for a volcano that's not prepared or close to erupting. So that's one thing you have to look at. But
it creates a space where it can erupt.
Yeah, or overpressure, you know, because again, you have a lot of stuff going on, and so that's one of the parameters you look at if you're saying, okay, because they've studied it and said, okay, there are volcanoes that are at risk because they're on faults, but you also look at what's the period of time since the last eruption. You know, if it just erupted 100 years ago, well, an earthquake's probably not going to trigger an eruption because it's not built. The overpressure hasn't built up yet again. That's typically how volcanoes, they erupt, and then over time, the pressure builds up again, and then they erupt again. And depending on what's underneath them, it may be, every 500 years, some 10,000. I mean, they're not all the same. Mount St. Helens is probably the one volcano that Americans are familiar with. Right.
Do you know when the one before 1982 was?
I'd have to look it up. It's in the book,
okay.
I think. But I think it was like 1800s or something like that.
Okay, so
but it wasn't as catastrophic, I don't think. I mean, there's also that's the other thing you look at. It's a VEI. There's a VEI index, explosivity index of an eruption. So you actually rate the eruption according to the amount of energy that it released. So you have like Krakatoa as like a VEI 10 or something. And I also looked at that. So I said, okay, what level of eruption do we really need to get the third Nephi event? And I also looked at because it's possible you have two volcanoes erupting at the same time. And it has occurred in the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia. So those are possibilities.
Does it happen in Hawaii a lot with multiple volcanoes?
Not really, because Hawaii is it's a little different. Number one, it's a different kind of volcano than what you find for the most part in Mesoamerica. There's explosive volcano like Mount St. Helens that create these pyroclastic flows, and those are typically on what we call subduction zones, where you actually have a crustal plate going underneath another plate, and so it builds up, and then you have the overpressure. There's the other kind is kind of a shield volcano, which is basically where you have fissures occurring, where it's a spreading center. So you have, like at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, right? There's not a plate going underneath there, but there's volcanoes underneath the water, and it's because it's the plate is separating. I mean, there's a kind of a liquidy mantle that they ride on top of. That's what's pushing, these plates around, and so there's spreading. But it's, because one's spreading, another one's going underneath another plate. And so it's a different kind of volcano. Hawaii is a little particular because it's basically you have a hot spot that's coming up. It doesn't really follow, it's not really a subduction zone. It's not really a spreading center. And so that's why you have the big island is active, but the other islands, as you get progressively
are not
north, and they're older. So,
right.
So they used to be over the hot spot.
And the
plate
big
moved.
Is now.
The plate moved. Another one came up. The plate kept moving, right? And a lot of them, start below the ocean as they form. And so that's why the big island is active and Oahu isn't. is because it's moved off of the hot spot that's coming up from the mantle. So that's kind of a
So we have no worry about Diamond Head exploding.
Well, I mean, I guess there's some theory that maybe there's still some seepage or something like that, but yeah, it's not. It's pretty much inactive, right? So, so that's why Hawaii is a little different than most of the other volcanoes.
Okay.
And so you have, and so the explosive volcanoes are typically off of subduction zones, like Mount St. Helens. You have the Juan de Fuca plate coming underneath North America. And so, and that volcanoes don't occur right where the subduction, they occur some distance back. There's what's called a volcanic arc, typically. So you have a series of volcanoes, like Shasta and Rainier, and I mean, that's part of the volcanic arc, if you will, that's from that plate going underneath. And so, so you have to have the right kind of volcano too. The one that's described in the Book of Mormon is not. It's not like Hawaii. It's dangerous, but only if you can't outrun the lava, right? Because it doesn't.
It's pretty slow.
Yeah, because pyroclastic, like Mount St. Helens, it just produces this
Just exploded.
ash, a lot of ash, superheated, and just comes out at such speed nobody could escape, and it just kills, and it wipes out, for anything in its way, and it's just it's very. Those are the worst kind of volcanoes, right? And so,
Is that what Pompeii was as well? Probably.
Well, Vesuvius, Italy's kind of complex, actually. So it's interesting because Vesuvius is that kind of volcano, but Etna is not down in Sicily.
Oh,
Yeah, so they kind of have this very complex geology of kind of spreading and then one's going underneath. So it's not like it's also clean, but yeah. So, and the Book of Mormon is describing a pyroclastic type of volcano. Yes, because
what's the difference? So pyroclastic explode,
and you get ash everywhere.
And
They're a mist of darkness. Right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Whereas the shield is that more like Hawaii, where it just kind of drip, drip, drip. Here out comes the lava. And
yeah. Or you get like cinder cones that are like sputtering. They're not like they're forming over time. There's not some big blast.
Okay.
And even Hawaii, typically they don't have
a lot of ash.
Yeah, and they have explosions, but it's more local and mostly just.
I'm trying to remember. There was a recent. Was it in Iceland or Greenland? One of those where.
In Iceland is actually on the Mid Atlantic Ridge, so it's actually a spreading. Those volcanoes up there for the most part.
Those are spreading ones.
Yeah, that's actually kind of what you're going to see under the water. If you could go down to if you're at the bottom of the ocean, you'd see kind of the Icelandic kind of.
I remember there was problems with some airplanes that had to go around because they can see rain and the weather, but there was a problem where they flew into volcanic ash and the radar couldn't see it for some reason, and they had some real problems keeping the flood.
And it's not that you can't have some ash coming out of those kind, but you don't have it's a super explosive type of pyroclastic events, basically. Again, I'm simplifying. Some geologists will probably comment, hey, he's not 100%. I'm just generalizing a few of these things. So that's what I looked at. It says, okay, so anybody that's proposing, let's say the Heartland, that's the issue, is the New Madrid fault. Yeah, right. It's a very powerful fault. But what you have in earthquakes is you have what's called attenuation zones. So you have the fault, and you have some distance off the fault where you'll get damage. Obviously, it decreases farther away. Now, some of it depends on what kind of material. Again, if you have liquefaction or other unstable material, maybe you get damaged a lot further away. Like Mexico City, they have they'll have an earthquake under the ocean in the Pacific, right on the edge, and the waves will travel and not really damage much in between. But then it hits Mexico City, which is built on lake sediments and unconsolidated fill. And actually is at such a depth that it actually creates harmonic with some of the earthquake. And so it just basically accentuates the damage. So it's not just this arithmetic, this far away. You have to look at the rocks, and they develop what's called attenuation formulas for each fault, like California, like the
San
Andreas, right. So they'll say, and basically because they've got seismic measurements all over the place. So then they have an earthquake and they put that into their model, right? So they're saying, oh, okay, actually we had shaking clear out over here. So So they actually have a complex attenuation model. Again, the theory is to try to predict if you have a, Richter 7, 8, whatever, how far is that damage, going to extend away from the fault. So that's the theory. The problem is like the New Madrid. I don't have anything against Heartland people, whatever, they kind of promote their own model, but I haven't really published it. But the reality is you have the New Madrid, which is a powerful fault, but then you have to look at the attenuation zones away from it. And yes, you can have damage adjacent. And then they say, well, hey, there's some bells ringing up in Boston.
Yeah, in Connecticut, I heard.
Yeah, but it's like, well, to ring a bell's just a pendulum, a free-sitting pendulum. It doesn't take much movement to get something like that to swing. And again, that's like a Mercalli 2. It's not enough to collapse.
Right.
Yes, there is some effect, but it's such a distance, it's never going to be that powerful, like the Book of Mormon described, right? And so, again, and it's like, I don't know what the Heartland people say or don't say, but some say, well, Zarahemla clear up here and they have land northward in Canada. I'm like, well, Book of Mormon says a huge amount of damage occurred in the land northward, the greater amount. So how are you going to explain that with the New Madrid fault that's located so far away? It's the devil in details, right? You can't just say, "Oh, I got this model. It's got a fault in it." Yeah. You actually have to put it. Where is the fault? Where does your model? Where do you have things in your model?
Is the damage going to be in the area where the Book of Mormon says it was?
Exactly. So that's kind of what I was trying to do in this book. Is say, okay, guys, you can't just say, "Oh, we got this earthquake," or you actually have to lay it in and say, "Does it?" Which has kind of made a few people mad in Mesoamerica too, because they had some that had Ammonite. I was like, well, that's not in a seismic area where you have it. And they had like all the cities on the east of Yucatan. I was like, no, Yucatan Peninsula, it's like the most stable. Not until the very, you get to the very southeast corner, then there's a fault system, but it's like the most stable seismically in all of Mesoamerica is the Yucatan Peninsula. So throwing some cities out there that require an earthquake doesn't really work. And again, it's like I'm just telling you. I mean, you guys are doing the models. I'm not here trying to bash you, but I'm just saying this is a parameter you have to consider. You can't just have these general statements or arguments. And like the Heartland, they kind of say, well, the mists of darkness. There's what's called, they call it earthquake fog. There's a kind of anecdotal evidence of some.
Well, my thought is
but that was only local to the fault, and it was basically condensate coming up from saturated soil. So it's not where they have, and these sand blows. It was like, there's sand blows. They go up 100 feet or so, but they don't last 3 days, and they're, again, proximate to the fault. So if you have the land northward in Canada, you have to have a mist of darkness that can cover the land northward, because that's what the Book of Mormon says, or at least a significant amount of the land northward.
I know it was the 1930s, there was the Dust Bowl problem, and it was basically because we really had bad land management with the farmers and everything, and it created, to me, that would be a huge mist of darkness. And also, do we have any record, or would there even be any geological record of like a Dust Bowl type activity?
Well, you might find it in, if there's deposition of it over time. But again, the other thing I looked at is the time frame. You have to have it 3 hours, right? That's what the Book of Mormon says. And then 3 days. So you have the main event for 3 hours. Then it also talks about for 3 days there was groaning, tumultuous noises, quaking. And so that's your time frame. So you can't just, okay, we have this storm that, it's got to be a 3 hour duration, and the mists of darkness have to cover most areas fairly shortly after that.
Like a volcano, like Mount St. Helens.
Yeah, right.
Because I do remember when that thing went off, it was like pitch black at noonday. Like it really, and Mount St. Helens, if it was in the right spot, would really explain the mists of darkness.
Exactly. And it says they couldn't burn their wood, right? It snuffed it out, so they couldn't do fire. So again, and it was mist. It wasn't just vapor. They talk about vapor too, but mist. So it's like almost a tangible something, So it does match, right? Mm-hmm. And so then, so the question is then, okay, so you have a regional earthquake and a volcano. Where do you have that? So you've got to have a volcano that sits on or adjacent to a regional fault system. If you're looking at a volcano, if you just want to ignore it and say it's whatever, but I'm just saying you've got to explain all these things. You can't just explain 80% of them.
Right.
You can't just cherry pick when you're trying to do Book of Mormon geography. You have to look at everything. And so that was the point of the book, was to say, okay, here are the parameters. Now, you can debate, get some tumultuous noise from something else, I don't know what, but, and then the other interesting...
But a volcano would explain it the best. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because volcanoes, it's almost like a symphony. Is how simple they have. Can make all kinds of sounds. And specifically, the interesting thing is the prime volcano that looked like it was the volcano for the third Nephi event is the San Martin volcano. It's in the very land northward, right in the middle, Olmec land northward. It has high groundwater, so it's phreatomagmatic, meaning it's a very noisy volcano. It has all kinds of explosions related to the groundwater that then turns to steam. In fact, there were the 1792 eruption.
Turns to mist?
It can, yeah. and so you actually have, the 1792 eruption was recorded, written, and like a naturalist came over and documented from Spain all the things that happened, and actually said where the ash was observed, which I kind of showed, mapped it out in my book and said, look, actually it can probably cover the land southward and northward pretty well. I mean, even in that eruption, looked like ash went that far. And so, but when it erupted, it was, and the interesting thing is they called it a great storm because the volcano was, at the time, that was hidden with clouds. So all they saw, again, these are people maybe never seen a volcanic eruption of that sort or any at all, because sometimes they live in an area that only has one volcano. And so they described it as basically a great storm that came, and they ran down to the port of Veracruz because they thought pirates were attacking because they thought it was cannon fire.
Oh.
Yeah, because the volcano was just boom, 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 making all of these all night, because it was a very noisy volcano.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, so that's why I say that actually volcano matches very well the description.
Well, even because volcanoes, especially Mount St. Helens, affected the weather. Like there are lightning storms and
yeah, and if
I'm trying to remember,
if you look at like the cover of the book, that's a volcanic eruption light.
Pull it over closer. Yeah, there you go.
So you have, this is in Chile, and it's a little bit time lapsed, but you have these sharp lightning. That's what was described, and basically it's the dust cloud is generating the static electricity that then creates the lightning.
Well, even in Saints, it talks about the volcano, was it in the Philippines, that caused basically global cooling, which caused the Smith Farm to fail.
Right. Yeah, because especially if they go high, right? They get into the stratosphere, they shield, and they go worldwide. Like Krakatoa did the same.
And I don't mean to get into global warming, global cooling, but I've heard that's a possibility is, if a volcano, I don't remember, was it Mount Pinatubo? What'd you say?
That'll save us from global warming.
Yeah, then it'll cool the earth.
Well, for a period of time.
Right.
So, so that's, and that's what the book, I kind of go through all the hazards described in the text of the Book of Mormon and all the damage. It says, okay, here are the things that could cause those things. Some are related to earthquakes, some are related to the volcano, but all of them are covered by both. So a volcanic eruption together with a regional earthquake will give you all of the effects that are identified in the Book of Mormon. So I'm basically saying, yes, the Book of Mormon, the description, of course, they don't say, oh, this, we had a strike slip fault. They're just explaining some horrendous event they didn't understand what was going on. It was God was punishing them.
It was a pyroclastic volcano.
Yeah, right. And so, even like the sinking of Moroni into the sea, well, you actually have that if you have, liquefaction from an earthquake. That actually happened.
We keep joking about San Andreas that LA is going to fall into the ocean, right? Is that going to happen sometime?
No, because it's a strike slip. So it's not a spreading center.
Okay.
If it was a spreading center,
it's the wrong kind of fault.
Yeah. Well, parts of it might. I mean, actually, California, a lot of it is accreted, meaning it's material that's got accreted from the movement of the fault and of smidgens of. It's actually made up of. It's very kind of geologically complex. A lot of it. But again, that's a good example. That's another thing I figured out too. It's the description in the Book of Mormon. So there's different kind of faults, right? There's what's called a normal fault that's up and down.
Okay.
A thrust fault means it goes up over, the hanging wall goes up over, and then there's a strike slip where it's horizontal movement, like the San Andreas for the most part.
Okay.
but strike slips actually create all kinds of weird fracture patterns and that's kind of sounds like that's what the Book of Mormon is describing, where it says, the rocks rent and there were cracks everywhere and the roads were all broken up, and it seems like not for sure, but I'm just saying it actually.
So strike slip sounds like the best.
Yeah, and actually, so I looked at Mesoamerica, and you have basically the subduction zone on the Pacific side. It's complex because there's like a plate rotating against another plate, and the Cocos plate going underneath the North American plate and the Caribbean plate. It's pretty complex, at least for terms of your subduction and your tectonics, what they call the tectonic plates. But you do have a strike slip fault, goes right through the San Martin volcano. In fact, the structure of the volcano is dictated by the fault system, meaning where it erupts along fault plains. And so that actually matched very well up on the Veracruz fault system, where the one on the Pacific is a subduction, and it's mostly deep earthquakes. They're powerful to a point, but they don't necessarily generate all that kind of the same level of structural, of cracking and fissuring that you would get.
So does one type of quake last longer than another? The strike slip versus the...
That's dictated more by what pressure is needing to be released.
Okay.
And
so not necessarily.
Nature. Yeah, but again, that's what you're looking at. You have quakings occurring over 3 days. So you have a major, and actually in the 3-hour period it said quakings. So you actually could have multiple quake. Yeah, so for 3 hours you have hit, and then it has quakings for 3 more days. Now that could also be, maybe there are still some volcanic earthquakes locally from the volcano, because the tumultuous noises continuing indicates probably the volcano was continuing to erupt at some level. And it's not atypical for a volcano to erupt and then have, smaller eruptions and things going on for some period of time. Often they're, 4 months apart or something. Even Mount St. Helens, you had the eruption, then you had the dome start to build within the crater. So you still had some volcanic activity going on some time after the eruption. Now there's not much going on. But so essentially, you have the 3 days where you have tumultuous noises, groanings. So it sounds like, that's a pretty good description. And they couldn't see anything, right? Because they were, they couldn't describe lightning because they were covered with ash.
So let me ask you this.
Does that make sense?
Because it sounds like, because you said there's different types of volcanoes. Are there different types in Central America as well? So you started with a pyroclastic and then you went to a shield type?
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about the San Martin is it's actually a little of both. It can be pyroclastic, but it also, because it's actually in a situation where it's slipping and spreading a bit, but it's also part of the subduction zone. So there are complex volcanoes. It's not all, I was kind of describing the more simplistic kind, but like in Italy, right? You've got one volcano here. They're different kinds, not very far from each other.
Etna was what kind again?
It's a shield.
Okay.
Yeah, shield. So, and again, we don't, you kind of know what's below the surface, but, you can't, we don't know everything that's going on in the mantle or something. So sometimes, like Hawaii, there's certain exceptions to,
Is Hawaii shield as well or no?
Well, it's called a shield, but it's not from a spreading center or a subduction zone. It's kind of this hot spot from the mantle that's coming up and that just blebbing up in that place. I haven't studied it a ton. Maybe they have better theories now, or when I looked at it when I was in college. It's not it's not Book of Mormon area, so I never really looked at it. And I also, one thing I did is I worked as a precious metals exploration when I was younger and in Nevada, and so there's huge volcanoes that erupted anciently that spread. They're ashfall all over Utah, all over Nevada, and so I was familiar with volcanics, eruptions and things like that. Also, not just from school, but from actually mapping in volcanic units and
because even Utah has some volcanoes, especially in like southern Utah, it seems like.
Yeah, and there you have some difference. Like it's, but those are more like spreading type because we're basin and range. We're kind of spreading. That's why our faults are like falling up and down because it's kind of spreading. And so you have those cinder cones outside of Fillmore, the red pumice that you buy.
Right.
That's coming from not a pyroclastic. That's more of a cinder cone type
And even Yellowstone is a gigantic volcano, right?
Yeah, it's a super. Again, those are the super volcanoes. That's what I'm talking about. Anciently, the volcanoes that we have a geologic record of, some of them are huge, and ash falls covering half the western United States, not just around Mount St. Helens. I mean, I'm not. We're not talking about that for Book of Mormon. That's the other thing I looked at. I said, well, how powerful of a volcano do you need? And it's like, well, you don't need a huge Krakatoa type destruction. All you need is just to get ash to the land northward, land southward, have some destruction.
So like a Mount St. Helens type, would that be the type of volcano?
Yeah, that type of eruption or something close to that. But that may even be higher. I mean, I think that's like a VI8 or something. And I'm saying it could even be less of, and still, depending on where your cities are.
Right.
And it talks about, the unfortunate thing is, not unfortunate, just what it is, but Book of Mormon talks about the cities that were destroyed. So I go through each city, talk about where it might be located. Where Sorensen had it in the model, he didn't have all of them, because some are only mentioned at the time of the destruction, like Josh or whatever. But Josh actually, I think, means fire in Hebrew. So some of them, I think, they got their name because they were destroyed by fire. I mean, that's why they called it that. But I did look at that. I said, okay, so these were ones where it said the fire rained down or came down from the sky, basically, and destroyed them. So I said, okay, we don't have really good studies, but I said, okay, let's take Krakatoa. That was a big one. How far away from the volcano did you actually have stuff that could come down and light cities on fire and burn? The actual fallout from it.
And Krakatoa is where?
That's like in the Pacific, but it was just it's over kind of Philippines, I think. Indonesia, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, but that was one where actually I had some information because some people clothes caught on fire that were 40 miles away from the volcano. So I said, okay, so I can use the geology to at least say, okay, these cities were within this proximity. The ones that were burned with fire. Zarahemla was a little different because it took fire, but some said the fire came down. So you're saying, okay, so those cities are going to be somewhere within the proximity, this distance away from the volcano. So I was able to say, okay, I can, and also applying the geology can help you locate. If you can identify the geology, then you can then better locate where these cities might be.
Right.
So it was kind of an iterative thing. So once you apply the geologic parameters to the model, then in fact you can then, improve your model. Not only verify your model, you can improve the model by saying, okay, these cities are probably up in here.
Mm-hmm.
So, that was kind of the gist of the book, was to actually, verify that yes, all the events in the Book of Mormon that are geologically appear to have a geological element can be explained with geology, and specifically the Mesoamerican models. Then second, can it help identify, further clarify your model once you figured that out? And so that was kind of the crux of the premise of the book, was to kind of get people thinking about it. It wasn't necessarily proving the Book of Mormon. I don't really care about that. And, could Joseph Smith have known this or not? I don't care. Just the presumption is if the Book of Mormon is what it says it is, does the science support it?
Right.
Yeah. So, you obviously have to look at what does this term mean? Could it, if it's early modern English or things like that. I do have to look at the text and interpret a bit, that the translation may be. And it's clear that obviously the account that's being laid down by presumably Nephi, right, the prophet at the time, or whoever did the large plates, it is clear they're trying to, I don't say trying, but they are correlating with the prophecies, right? So all of the items identified in the prophecies are also discussed or accentuated in the description.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they wanted to make sure that, that all the things talked about are found in the destruction. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Some historians would say, well, that must mean it took place after so that the prophecy could be guaranteed to work, right?
Yeah, I guess. But not a historian. Again, I'm not getting into all that stuff. I'm just saying, listen, here's what it is. Here's the description. Does it match?
Okay.
And then, the other thing is, I did talk about, there were a couple things I didn't talk about in the book that I have since published. That is like, there's actually a geological event in the old world, right? Lehi goes out and sees a pillar of fire coming out of a rock. So the interesting thing is actually I looked at, the lands where the tribe of Manasseh, lands of his inheritance, where he would have gone. There is a volcanic field there. So that actually...
In Israel? Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one reason you're saying, why isn't there a volcano? It's like, well, Israel didn't really have a volcano. There's a word for volcano. You don't find it in Hebrew. So great storm is actually a pretty good explanation. In fact, there's other people have looked at the whole Sinai event. It's a volcano, right? Shaking, fire, cloud.
I've heard that, that might have turned the Nile to blood.
Well, that was I think that was kind of upstream. These ones are saying, well, where they went, after they left and went to Mount Sinai. So Mount Sinai is not at the headwaters of the Nile. They're just saying there was some mud or something from some event. But they're actually saying in southern, kind of it's kind of Mount Bedr, I think, in Saudi Arabia is a good candidate for Mount Sinai because it was a volcano, right? Well, it had pillar of fire by night, smoke by day. It does sound like a volcano. Mm-hmm. But they called that, again, some of the translations have that as a storm event. Even the Ezekiel vision where he talks about these balls of fire and thing, well, ball lightning comes out of some volcanoes. Where he was at, there was an active volcano north of him about 50 miles. I'm not saying, all the elements of the vision, but it kind of could match, that there maybe there was something going on. So, and then I also looked at the cloud where it talks about the Jaredites, where they were led by the cloud. They went to the land of Nimrod in a cloud. So I actually said, okay, there is an active volcano right there up in the area of Nimrod, so that actually matches. And then I kind of actually said, if they took this route, you have volcanoes that erupted during that time frame, 2500 BC, periodically, that if they were erupting at some distance, in the open sea, that would be a guide to them. So, it's a little bit more speculative. So I did say, okay, that might also be some geological explanation for that. So, but I did that in a different book. So those aren't in there. But I also did take, there are some events in Ether that talk about, destruction like we've never seen, kind of using the same language that was used in the third Nephi. And there were times when the three volcanoes adjacent were erupting at the same time, 2 times. The Heth event where the snakes came out, that'd be typical of an eruption that they have to migrate because they can't, their habitat's been disturbed. So there are, and that can help tie in the Jaredite chronology too. So, those are points where I know the eruptions took place during a certain, 100-year period. So you can kind of lay in, that helps you lay out your Jaredite chronology. It gives you some anchor points because that's kind of the difficult thing in the Jaredite. You don't have you have like king reigns and stuff you can kind of figure out, but you have to have some fixed points to anchor it to. And then you have a gap in the middle where you don't know how long it went from Replikish, where it just said the descendant, it didn't say son, So I did look at other geological events in later books. Actually, the book I'm working on now has the Lehi event. So that was kind of the crux of the book, and is laying in all of those things that are found in the Book of Mormon to help, better identify your geographic model. It's just one parameter. There are others, but some just fail, right? That's a problem with the Heartland. You don't really have. You can say there's a fault, but you say, well, the mists of darkness where this earthquake condensated. I'm just like, well, you just don't get that distance away from it. Those are all proximate to the fault. It's very rare, but even then, okay, let's consider that. So that maybe somebody can make a model that's smaller. I don't know that actually can redo their model so the geological parameter fits. I'm not doing that, but So
from your point of view, geologically, Meso is probably the best fit for the Book of Mormon.
well, I'd say the Sorensen model actually worked very well. He had like the land, like the city of Bountiful, where he had it. It was an area that was stable. It didn't have liquefaction where he had it, and right across the river there was a horrible liquefaction zone. So you're like, okay, because they went to Bountiful because it wasn't destroyed, but they could look around and see the destruction. Well, makes total sense from the Temple of Bountiful. They could just look across the river, and where there was a high area of high liquefaction, everything got wiped out. So those kinds of things that, so you look and say, yeah, the model, what he's laid out fits pretty well. Is that the correct one? It's not the only parameter, but yeah, that it works.
So it would be better than Baja. It would be better than Heartland.
Yeah. Again, the Baja issue is, where is your vapor? You have to have vapors killing people too, right? And those come off volcanoes. That can carbon dioxide or hydrogen sulfide that can just kill people immediately. And so again, you kind of have, you can have certain elements work, but you have to look at all of the things talked about in the Book of Mormon. And that's the problem with the Baja. Number one, if they're relying on a volcano, they don't have volcanic eruptions. I mean, there are other problems. They don't have really people. So, there's really no history of civilization there. So there's not really people to be killed by a volcano. I don't look at that, but I'm just saying. Yeah. I mean, there are other, and so you'd say, yeah, it doesn't really work. Now they'd say, well, there's this fog, and then it came. And that was the meteorological. They were saying, oh, there's this great storm, like a hurricane. I looked at that. I said, well, I looked at all the hurricane tracks, timing from 1823, when they occurred, and because we know Christ basically when he died, right, late March, early April. Hurricanes, almost none go that early, like one. So if you're claiming a great storm as a hurricane, it doesn't work because you just typically don't have those. And also, it had to be 3 hours. Hurricanes don't usually last that short a time, and if they do, they aren't very powerful. They're dry. So I'm just saying, so I even looked at that. So if you're looking at the great storm, some meteorological event, can't just say it's a hurricane. Okay, then where are you going to get that kind of storm that's going to cause that kind of destruction? So
are there tornadoes that spin off from volcanoes as well?
Yeah, that's after. They're not necessarily.
Or the Book of Mormon would say whirlwinds. Yeah. Yeah,
I mean the event itself could be actually described as there's all kinds of wind when the explosion happens. And then after a pyroclastic flow comes through, there are small whirlwinds. I'm not saying those were necessarily that powerful, but yeah. And so I do think they're talking about, maybe the eruption itself or periodic eruptions creating these pyroclastic flows that just kind of blow everything around. So, yeah. So again, is it evidence that the Book of Mormon is true, historical? Well, yeah, I would say that, because the description, and it's kind of curious because like there was one that talked about where hills and valleys were left in the stead thereof, right? Well, that was actually a morphological feature that really wasn't identified by a lot of geologists or most geologists until the Mount St. Helens. And actually, after the pyroclastic flow is done, you have these hills and valleys where the ash deposits in that form. So it actually matches the post-volcanic, what you would expect after pyroclastic flow has gone through. So some things are kind of, hey, well, would Joseph Smith know that? I don't think so. But again, I don't care about, I don't get into what Joseph Smith knew or didn't know. I'll leave that to all the other guys publishing stuff about it, which there are so many I can't keep up. But.
What about Melee? Have you checked Melee?
I didn't really, mostly because, and again, I didn't really. A lot of people have called, says, "Hey, check this model." It's like, you know what? It takes a lot of time to do the research on all the volcanoes. I mean, especially in Central America, there's like a couple hundred. So I'm trying to find papers on every one, and part of the issue there is simply it's just. I mean, I think Moroni said it was in the Americas, right? So I'm basing that premise, and they can look at that if they think it works. They're volcanoes, right? But I don't know whether they have the land northward. And I think it's only 1 or 2 people proposing that model. So I don't. Again, I moved on to other research. This was 7, 8 years ago. So I'm not out there just as the model. I just ran and says, if you want to do it, here's the book. Go look at Malay, see if all the parameters can be found. More power to you.
Yeah.
The other models, like I said, I didn't really go and say, hey, here's a big analysis of the Heartland. It's just, well, there's some things that just obviously have some problems without a lot of research, right? I mean, it just, you have the land northward and, north of the Great Lakes. So how are you getting the major part of the destruction up there? Forget about whether there were kings there or not. I mean, that's it's a big thing. There are no kings. I'm like, well, I think they got kings in Canada for a while. But again, that's not really what. That's more of a Brant Gardner kind of, analysis that he would do. So
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jerry Grover. In our next conversation, we're going to continue to talk to Jerry, and this time we're going to talk about the Book of Mormon star, in which there was a night of no darkness.
Yeah, so it's a known document. And if you look at it, it only occurred on one side of the Earth because it was a short duration, 12 hours. It was actually 2 in a row, that event. And so that actually explains both the brightness and the signs and wonders, which they had not seen, right? I mean, and...
Is it like the Northern Lights or something like that?
Yeah, so the Northern Lights, number one, it wasn't just their standard Northern Lights. They were crazy.
If you like what we're doing here on Gospel Tangents, please become a paid subscriber at gospeltangents.com or patreon.com/gospeltangents. We've got full transcripts on our website at gospeltangents.com. And if you'd like to check out some of our other conversations, click over here. Thanks.